Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Archana, a research analyst at the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. Thank you for joining the panel discussion on the Quad and ASEAN, the way forward. This is the third in the series of panel discussions on the Quad and Indo-Pacific, jointly organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Japan. Before we proceed with the event, we would appreciate if you could mute your microphones throughout the session. If you have any questions or comments or feedback to share, please forward them via the Zoom chat. This afternoon, we are delighted to have the following all-women distinguished guest speakers with us for the panel discussion. Professor Shankari Sundaraman, Center for the Indo-Pacific Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. Associate Professor Saya Kiba, Faculty of Intercultural Communication, Komatsu University, Japan. And Ms. Jane Chan, Senior Fellow and Coordinator, Maritime Security Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU. The panel discussion will be chaired by Dr. Yogesh Joshi, Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. I now invite Dr. Yogesh Joshi to chair the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Archana, as always. Hello and welcome to this third edition of Sasakawa Peace Foundation and Institute of South Asian Studies panel discussions on the most pressing issues of geopolitical churn we are witnessing in the Indo-Pacific. Today's discussion revolves around the complementarities and contradictions between ASEAN, the region's oldest and most prominent regional framework, and the Quadrilateral Security Initiative, or the Quad, its newest. Quad and ASEAN has had a long relationship. ASEAN, as I would see, acted as Quad's incubator, first by bringing Japan to ASEAN's fold in 1993, and then bringing India and Australia in 1996 through ASEAN +6. If you remember, the first Quad meeting actually happened in the shadow of Asian Regional Forum in 2007 in Manila. However, in recent years, we have seen some kind of contradictions which are emerging between Quad and the ASEAN, particularly since in the aftermath of the COVID. In 2020, there was first standalone meeting of the Quad foreign ministers. The second important issue is that Quad countries kind of feel that ASEAN is worried about the lack of resolve of taking upon China. ASEAN countries, on the other hand, think that Quad is unnecessarily securitizing the domain in the Indo-Pacific. There is also this feeling that ASEAN is too much focused on soft issues. The same can be said from ASEAN countries towards Quad. And lastly, there is a probability that Quad can become more institutionalized with a Quad summit in all probability happening in some time. But not all is wrong. A 2018 survey by Australian Strategic Policy Institute on perceptions of the Quad among ASEAN countries kind of made very interesting points. 57% of ASEAN countries, or the people surveyed in ASEAN countries, supported the Quad, whereas 37% supported it if Quad succeeds. So in some sense, Quad's success might have some implications on how ASEAN perceives it. In some sense, it also tells you that ASEAN is hedging. However, three most fundamental assumptions which undergirded ASEAN's emergence are now under huge, is facing larger contradictions. First is the whole assumption of peaceful rise of China as the region's torchbearer. The second is the continued American commitment to the region. But most importantly, the idea that there would not be a Thucydides trap where ASEAN would fall, particularly with the prospects of a hegemonic war between ASEAN and the US. And to therefore discuss this very important issue in the geopolitical churning of Indo-Pacific, we have organized this panel, and we have three distinguished experts to talk about how the relationship between Quad and ASEAN. First of all, I would like I would welcome Dr. Shankari Sundaraman, who was not only a mentor, but a great friend from my PhD days at JNU. Her areas of research relate to Southeast Asia with particular focus on Indonesia, Cambodia, and Myanmar. She has been a former visiting fellow to the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at the Australian National University and a visiting fellow with the Asian Scholarship Foundation at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Jakarta. She has written extensively on issues concerning India and ASEAN in general. Dr. Saya Kiba is an associate professor at Komatsu University in Japan. Her major fields of interest are Southeast Asian studies, civil-military relations, international cooperation, policies, and defense diplomacy. Prior to that, she served as a member of staff to Congressman C.G. Maeda from 2010 to 2012. She has also worked in the Embassy of Japan in the Philippines, Embassy of Japan in Thailand, and a Japan-based international organization for conflict prevention. Lastly, Ms. Jane Chan Gitien is a senior fellow and coordinator of the Maritime Security Program at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Her main research interests include maritime security issues in Southeast Asia, law and order at sea, and regional maritime cooperation and confidence building measures. And lastly, on regional boundary delimitation and territorial dispute. She is an affiliated faculty at the Singapore Armed Forces NTU Academy. So welcome to all of you to the panel. And the way we're gonna go through this panel is each of our speakers would have around 10 minutes to put forward their central claims, and then we will be open for discussion. So we will go as per the program, and I will now hand over the mic to Dr. Shankari Sundaraman. Over to you, Shankari. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And a good day to everyone as we meet across different time zones, various time zones. At the outset, my sincere thanks to Professor Rajamohan, Yogesh, especially, and to the ISAS as well as the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for asking me to be part of today's deliberations. I think if we look at where the relevance of today's discussion lies for us, I would say it's because of two reasons. First and foremost, the pandemic has more than ever tested the realities of major power relations globally. And in that sense, what you see is that while we've seen the rancor that's been visible between the major powers, particularly the United States and China, the pandemic has just blown the lid off the issue totally. Second, I think we are also seeing more openly the way in which major powers, middle powers are approaching the wider Indo-Pacific regional issues. There is greater effort at reshaping this regional security architecture, and we are seeing the participation of more states into a much more layered kind of an approach, multiple forms of interactions are evolving. And I think in that sense, these are the two major issues where I think the relevance for us to study the ASEAN and the Quad becomes very important. If I go according to the concept note that Yogesh, you sent us, I would like to sort of look at it, highlight it in terms of the four questions that you've raised, which is one of the first question being, how does the Quad therefore perceive ASEAN? Now, if you look at the question of the Quad itself, I think ASEAN's ability to manage the regional environment is seen to have is based on many factors. And I think I'll just highlight a few of these. To the best of my mind, I believe that the Quad by no means perceives ASEAN to be irrelevant, but the geopolitical shifts that have occurred have actually started impacting the regional stability, which ASEAN has actually promoted very successfully for 2 decades after the Cold War. So if you look at the context as stakeholders and what are the stakeholders in the region, ASEAN will therefore be seen as one of the primary stakeholders in the region. But in the sense of promoting the normative approach, I think what we have to do is to look at two layered approaches, looking at the mega regional picture as well as the sub-regional picture. And in that sense, when you look at the mega regional context of the Indo-Pacific, you look at the maritime context, the entire debate on the free and open access, the global commons, maritime commons. I think there is this entire sense that the Quad is looking at a mega regional kind of a picture, whereas the ASEAN is focused on extending its sub-regional institutional mechanisms to an external kind of environment, So in that sense, I think when you see the view on ASEAN, how we look at ASEAN, I think think there is no singular kind of view that ASEAN has, say, on China, the United States, or the Quad. And I think that's why it's important. And similarly, the Quad's perception regarding ASEAN as process-oriented and not driven by product orientation also shows a distinct gap in terms of how the two are trying to sort of leverage each other's realities of the region itself. And in that sense, the Quad constantly reiterating the centrality, I think, of ASEAN is a very critical factor, because this centrality is something that the Quad speaks of every time there is a Quad meeting. And what you see is that the entire question of where the Quad and the ASEAN have a likely space to meet becomes relevant for us to sort of analyze. So there is, I would not say that the ASEAN is irrelevant in terms of what the Quad is, how the Quad is approaching the region. Now, if you take the second question that you've raised on the ASEAN's ability to ensure a peaceful Indo-Pacific, stable region, given its, its economic ties with China and the security level commitments with the United States, I think what we have to see is that ASEAN's approach to dealing with China, you said it, you said the gorilla in the room, that ASEAN's approach to dealing with China remains largely the same since the end of the Cold War, okay? Which is to engage China, socialize China into the ASEAN format, and at the same time, keep ensuring that other major powers are also part of that process, and which automatically leads to a counterbalancing. But I think what we've seen in recent times is the limits of this applicability, because it is not just about the rise of China, as you said, the peaceful rise of China, but the fact that there is a liberal international order that is being challenged with this rise, and the structural change that has brought certain geopolitical dimensions to it. So in that sense, I think balancing its close economic ties with China does not actually end up providing the ASEAN the space to manage the security level ties, because at times you've also seen that the Chinese actions have been punitive, especially on the economic front, okay? So there the cost for ASEAN would be very critical if that were to happen. Now, the second point that I'd like to make in this context is that if you look at the traditional processes that ASEAN has employed towards regional stability, I think the reliance is still on the EAS, and of course, moving from the ARF to the EAS. Now, in that sense, I think what limits both these organizations or mechanisms is that they remain at the level of confidence building alone through dialogue promoted by consensus and consultation, which is very critically a part of, which are the pillars of the ASEAN mechanism. And in that sense, what has happened is, as you've seen the geopolitical shifts that have occurred in the region, I think there is a sense that perhaps this is causing a certain limitation in how whether ASEAN could singularly, therefore, manage the region. Because if you look at the geopolitics, and I use this choice of word, whether ASEAN can singularly manage, with a great deal of deliberation, because if you look at the geopolitical kind of determinants that have emerged, I think it's not so much about ASEAN's relations with the major powers, because that is not under any threat, but the determinants are basically shifting because of the deteriorating relations between the major powers themselves. So, and it's interesting that as long as peace prevailed in the region in the post-Cold War period, the ability of ASEAN to externalize its processes was visible, and this provided the necessary space for promoting diplomatic processes within the larger context of Asia-Pacific. Now, this identity is currently under shift, and as a result, it sort of limits the ASEAN approach to singularly handling, in my view as an outsider, singularly handling the change. And I make this statement, like I said, with great deliberation. I think the environment is not just today shaped by ASEAN and China relations, but the environment is also increasingly shaped by China's relations with its bilateral relations with other major powers in the region. And here, I think the third question becomes relevant as to how ASEAN perceives the emergence of the Quad. And you already mentioned the paper by Huang Le-Thu that has come out of ASPI in 2018. And I think last year's IC survey on the state of Southeast Asia is also relevant in that sense. And I think primarily drawing upon, I'll just point out two indicators because of the time factor that we have 10 minutes. I think I'm probably already around 7 minutes down down that road. So primarily, let me draw on two or 3 points that I want to make. That if you look at the major power rivalry and the binary of choice between China and the United States, I think what becomes visible is that there is clearly a perception that the US is still the most reliable security partner. Okay, I won't go into the statistics of it, but I think that evidence is there in this year's State of Southeast Asia report, and that itself for me is very interesting. Now, the second thing that stands out in this year's report is that almost 88.6% of the respondents worry about the strategic clout that China may have on the region, And I think that this is extremely critical as it also somehow derives from the earlier question, the second question you asked, because then it is not just about China's economic clout that is being resisted, but the accompanying security dilemma that it projects as a result of its rise, particularly in the manner in which normative approach is being challenged. And I think this is where, as people who are looking at ASEAN, who are looking at the transitions that are shaping the larger Indo-Pacific, we need to sort of make the distinctions as to where this worry is coming from. So likewise, if you see the focus on the United States as a strategic partner, it has actually increased to show about 55.4% of respondents have seen it as a partner. So in that sense, if I take the third indicator as the trust deficit, I think China has ranked the highest with 63% no confidence, And this is an argument that actually kills the common destiny argument that China has actually been promoting. So if you go on to look at the issues on the South China Sea and in terms of militarization, it becomes even more clearer. So specifically on the Quad, I think the Quad is one thing that we've discussed in last year's report. It doesn't come out in this year's report. And there's very interesting dimension here that about 45.8% see it as positive or very positive if you clump the two together, and about 16% see it as negative or very negative. There is in between about 38% who are neutral on the Quad. And this is very interesting because that neutrality can either be taken as a negative or a positive, which time will tell on how the region and the issues evolve. Now, finally, the skepticism on the Quad, I think, is also, like I said, is not based on ASEAN as a whole, but as individual countries, And in that sense, what you see is that countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia are much more skeptical of the Quad as compared to countries like, say, the Philippines and Vietnam, which are seeing the Quad from a more positive kind of a perspective. So, but interestingly, when it came, the query on whether you should join the Quad, that has received, Quad activities, not the Quad, but Quad activities, that has actually received about almost 61.6% affirmation, So that is a very interesting thing. And if I have to sort of look at what are the complementarities, this brings me to the last point and the last question. What are the complementarities and contradictions? And I think there we have to be very careful in how the Quad is projected to the region. And it's very interesting because in any analysis, what I see is that if you refer to the Quad, as a democratic alliance or a democratic diamond, I think this terminology will not work in the region because the question of domestic politics and its implications will remain clear areas of dissonance as far as ASEAN countries are concerned. So I would be very clearly like to highlight that is going to be one contradiction. At the same time, if you look at the, because this vertical divide was visible even within the EAS. Now, the Quad Plus, in my view, should not be at this stage promoted because ASEAN has been extremely critical, particularly about what it calls the salami slicing of ASEAN by major powers. Now, and if the Quad Plus were to, consider pulling one or two member countries of ASEAN into the quadrilateral, not that it's not a framework that can be explored, but the point is that would be tantamount as far as I'm concerned to slicing the ASEAN, and that would not carry much weight as far as the ASEAN is concerned. Where are the complementarities? Let me first quickly say this. I think the complementarity lies in the promotion of international law and a rules-based order. Because if you look at the repeated repetition that has come out including the last ASEAN summit in June 2020, where UNCLOS was put forward as the way of resolving the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. I think these two basic principles will become the areas on which the Quad and the ASEAN can see some degrees of convergence. Okay, and if you look at the ASEAN Outlook, I'm not saying that the ASEAN Outlook is a very exceptionally, well documented kind of policy paper. The only thing I would like to say is that the outlook, as far as I know from whatever interactions I've had with the region, particularly the Indonesians, they call it a living document, and this is one of ASEAN's strengths, that you might at first take a very small step, but ASEAN tends to commit itself systematically and slowly to a process. And this has been ASEAN's strength for well over 50 years. Okay, so if you consider this to be the living document, then what you see is that there are areas of convergence, because it says that on common areas, the ASEAN will work with both regional and sub-regional mechanisms. And I think the only mention is that extra-regional mechanisms may also fit into this entire context if you an extra or different layer other than the ASEAN immediate ASEAN layer. So, and I think that is going to be a very interesting fact. So let me stop with this, and the rest of the questions I can take up in the Q&A section. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shankari, for that very interesting first presentation, I think, which would evoke a number of questions. But I completely, in a sense, agree with you in some sense about the capacity and instruments. But also, towards the end, you kind of suggested how ASEAN has been extremely practical. I would also suggest that there is a sense of ASEAN's realism. ASEAN has always been, in some sense, practiced realpolitik, which never gets upfront. But we should also give that much due to ASEAN countries in a sense. So now we will turn over to our second speaker for today's panel, Dr. Sayakiba. Dr. Sayakiba, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm glad to see you all, even though it's online. So I'd like to discuss how Japan can engage with Southeast Asia more effectively with the partnership with the US, Australia, and India, or other possible Quad members. I will propose two things. First, Japan and Quad countries should keep presenting various support menu to our partners in Southeast Asia. Second, Japan and Quad countries should enhance security-related cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, combining civilian aid and capacity building. So security cooperation does not simply mean military-to-military cooperation. And today, I particularly focus on soft approach rather than hard security with to Southeast Asian countries, which may soften the hostility or skepticism from the Southeast Asian countries to the securitized Quad approach. The first part, Japan should keep presenting various support menu to our partners in Southeast Asia. So for years, our Southeast Asian countries, our partners, showed their discomfort with US-China rivalry in the region. They are in tough and complicated positions. To nurture democracy supported by the United States and the international community, these countries have prioritized the rule of law, human rights, and freedom for decades. This has sometimes forced them to abandon autocratic order building in their own country. And historically, leaders of these countries had to manage their discomfort with Western values in exchange for economic and military assistance. As they have been bound by such values, now they feel more comfortable with a new counterpart, China, which has very different values and more generous in their world. So, however, they are not balancing between the United States and China or Japan and China in terms of economic and military power. They are simply comparing the scale and quality of economic assistance and security assistance from different countries. So what we can do is to keep presenting various support options. Our Southeast Asian partners should have a free hand to choose among different options. In that sense, free and open Indo-Pacific concept drawn by Japan and the US has been so far so good, I think. It is a concept to support Southeast Asia in various ways, like infrastructure investment to enhance connectivity, economic cooperation, ensure freedom of navigation, support the rule of law. It is a package of various programs, and the Southeast Asian partners can just choose whatever they like. So it already says free and open, right? Free and open Indo-Pacific. So without further reminder, they fully understand what is our value. We should not force them to choose our side. It is now widely understood that the ASEAN countries, the ASEAN member states, they don't want to take side. Okay, so the second point is that Japan should enhance security-related cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, combining civilian aid and capacity building. We can do much more utilizing civilian effort and diplomatic engagement in security issues. So there are various security needs in the region. When we say security cooperation, we easily imagine providing hard equipment for maritime security, giving vessels or missiles, teaching them international laws, joint exercises, trainings, etc. However, we need to understand security threat perception of Southeast Asian countries are much more diverse. 2 years ago, one of the security experts in the Philippines listed up their security threats in one of the international conferences. The first priority was illegal drug all over the country. Second is terrorism. Third, communist insurgency. Fourth, lack of capability of the security sector. Fifth is South China Sea issues. And sixth is climate change and natural disaster. So it reminds us that the most of the countries in the region still face a serious internal threat, and their perception of security is diverse. Okay. So there remains much room to develop more flexible and inclusive assistance based on such local security needs, I believe. Let me raise two concrete examples of security-related cooperation where we can start immediately. The first is the support to institutions of security sectors. Not only the incapable security institutions, but also anti-democratic ones. It is difficult to change the characteristics of the military in authoritarian states. Like we cannot change Thai military, we cannot change the Myanmar military. Their civil military relations are very past dependent, and even the United States has no way to reform them. So even in the transitional period from authoritarian regime to democracy in 1980s to 1990s, Southeast Asian countries did not feel significant external pressure. So what can we do? Soft approach is needed, I think. So for decades, Japan has extended governance support through sending civilian experts and advisors to various government agencies of new democracies. Such approach works, although the project outcome is often invisible and very slow. Let me quote a story of one retired military officer from an authoritarian country in Asia. I don't name them, but he recently told me that their military should learn how to cope with the parliament through Japan. And he used to be a military attaché to Japan, and he was very surprised how much the Ministry of Defense of Japan and Japan Self-Defense Forces mind the parliamentary debate over the overseas operations, overseas deployment of the self-defense forces, such as a UN peacekeeping operation or other related operations with the United States. So for us, it is very natural to value the parliamentary debate, but he was surprised and impressed. He repeats such story to his colleagues and young officers in his own country. I told him that in Western countries, they have much more stronger oversight mechanism, but he said that the Japan should be the model of Asia because the Western countries, because their officers of their own countries already share the stereotyped image that the Western style is intrusive. That's what he said. So in that sense, Japan and Quad can present new options to those countries, how to democratize or how to make an effective oversight mechanism over the security sector. And Japan has already done police-to-police cooperation in Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, sending Japanese police personnel to these countries to teach them not only the scientific technology, but also how to be community-friendly police, or how to be aware of the culture, how to win the heart and minds of the locals. So such support can be expanded to other security sectors so that our partners in Southeast Asia, which face various security threats, will appreciate such effort and eventually feel the value of democratic security institutions. Second, the second field of assistance can be through ADMM Plus framework. For the ASEAN member states, ASEAN centrality is very important. So in that sense, our effective engagement to ADMM through Plus as an ASEAN institute is welcomed by our partners in Southeast Asia. 4 years ago, ADMM Plus countries were very active in planning various activities, exercises, and conferences on HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. It was triggered by 2013 typhoons in the Philippines and 2015 Nepal earthquake. Recently, such HADR is simply losing momentum for a while, but we can expand that kind of cooperation for other fields like cybersecurity, epidemic control, or counterterrorism, which all member states can, and plus countries can share common interest and concern. So we can use the ADMM Plus platform or its experts working group in Quad institutionalism. It's like as a starting point. So in conclusion, I'd like to emphasize that the Quad has more potential in soft security-related cooperation through civilian effort or combination of military and civilian effort. I call it security governance, but whatever you call, such governance-centric approach must soften the hostility and skepticism from Southeast Asian countries to the Quad mechanism. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion session.
Thank you, Dr. Kiba, for such a important perspectives on how we can engage with ASEAN. The Quad countries can engage with ASEAN, and I agree with you in a sense that laying down this variation in perceptions on security challenges kind of deconstruct to a large extent this overemphasis on sovereignty issues, so to say, and there is where definitely Quad has a great potential to kind of engage with ASEAN. I will now hand over the floor to our final speaker, Ms. Jane Changitian, who's gonna present views from the region on how Quad and ASEAN can work together. Sure. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Yogesh. A very good day, one and all. A quick word of thanks to the organizers for the invitation. A privilege to join this gathering to share my thoughts and, of course, to learn from the experts with us today. I've divided my short remarks today in 3 parts. Since I mainly cover maritime issues in my day job, I will first very quickly share some broad assessments on the current states of affairs in Southeast Asian waters to add additional context, and then I'll run through, what in my mind are the 2 main factors behind ASEAN's reservation on the Quad. Both, my fellow panelists already highlighted them earlier. First, the China factor, where the prevailing perception is that supporting the Quad is synonymous to taking sides in the face of great power rivalry. The second, the ASEAN factor, will the Quad further erode ASEAN centrality? The third part in my remarks today is really more a set of questions I have on the Quad to help me think a little bit more about where the future lies for the Quad and ASEAN. It is rather clear that there is no common outlook on what the Southeast Asian maritime future should look like. Right? The prevailing assessment is a competitive one, insisting that the strategic environment is zero-sum and that is currently dominated by great power competition and rivalry. So even as extra-regional powers extend their interest to cooperate with Southeast Asia, there are concerns that these could add complexity to the ongoing Sino-US rivalry. So challenges to the traditional freedoms of the seas arising from jurisdictional disputes about who owns what, about jurisdictions and obligations of coastal states versus rights and duties of the user states, about environmental concerns, and about the lax observations of agreed principles of law, rules, and regulations. right? So we see nation states forgetting that UNCLOS was a product of grand bargain, one that was forged through very difficult compromises, which we may not achieve again. So in this vision of the world, we can expect very little cooperation, a rather high risk of fractured regional institution, and that of conflict. Of course, there's also a vision of a cooperative nature, reminding us that the success of our nations depends on seaborne trade and the globalized systems that it leads to. So acknowledging that this system is under threat, and it's not just because of great global competition. And Kiba Sensei already highlighted some of these common threats, presenting them as potential good avenues for cooperation. So moving on to the Quad, I think a common criticism in the literature is that the visions and strategy of the Quad countries regarding the Indo-Pacific differs, right? And this perceived lack of a common vision and strategy didn't imbue confidence within ASEAN and its member states. In my view, even if the Quad managed to present a common front, there will still be reservation in Southeast Asia, mainly because of what the Quad stands for, where most views the Quad as an effort to counter China. The reason for Australia pulling out of the Quad in 2008 and subsequently rejoining kind of proves this point. And no amount of statement from the Quad, including those at the highest level by the head of states, seems persuasive enough thus far. One key reason, which Prof. Shankari alluded to, is because how China views the Quad, justified or not, matters to Southeast Asia, right? And this is really my first point, the China factor. A key feature building into the ASEAN-led regional architecture is that it is open and inclusive. So no single state's influence is exclusive, so to speak, not China, not the US. So the various regional groupings provide an inclusive platform for ASEAN to engage with partner and extra-regional powers. So conversely, the Quad is now perceived to focus too much on excluding China rather than further integrating it into the regional framework. So whilst many in Southeast Asia do share the Quad's anxieties about China and still sees the US as the resident power in the region, ASEAN states still need to be very mindful of the robust and pragmatic relations with China that each has painstakingly nurtured. So Southeast Asian observers amongst us will know how challenging that can be from time to time. And this is clearly iterated by Singapore's Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, that Singapore, like the rest of Southeast Asia, I quote, live in the intersection of the interests of various major powers and must avoid being caught in the middle or forced into invidious choices, end quote. And since the region cannot exclude any of these powers, the best strategy has been to engage them all. The fact that China is at Southeast Asian doorsteps, its proximity and the correlating social, economic, cultural ties are links that cannot be decoupled. Of course, there are issues arising from those links, right? Not to mention the unresolved maritime disputes China has with its neighbors. In a way, we could say that there is still no good fences to make us good neighbors just yet, but this doesn't mean that China and ASEAN can't mend those fences. At this point, I believe that ASEAN simply does not have the confidence that China will be understanding. In a way that if ASEAN is seen to be promoting ties with Quad, ASEAN is not working against China. So why bear the additional onus to justify to China something that brings no clear and direct benefit to ASEAN at this point, and benefits that could be achieved by other means? So on to the ASEAN factor, and to illustrate this point, I think it's useful to consider how ASEAN has responded to the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and why ASEAN eventually came up with the Asean Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the AOIP, which really essentially steer clear from adopting the FOIP or the other Indo-Pacific concept, lock stock, conceived by the Quad countries, right? One of the key reasons I've already mentioned is the immediate is that it's not immediately evident that the members of the Quad share a common vision, so to speak. Ironically, right, the key principles of the FOIP and the other Indo-Pacific concepts held out there, right? Freedom of navigation, rule of law, respect for sovereignty, open markets, and the likes are in fact very attractive propositions to ASEAN. However, Southeast Asian states still hesitate to lend their full support owing to the reservations that ASEAN centrality could be negatively affected. So the concern here is a straightforward one. Will having another regional grouping that is not ASEAN-led threaten the ASEAN, the already fragile ASEAN centrality, right? We have since heard a chorus of assurance from all Quad countries, right? ASEAN centrality has been referred to as a core component of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Quad countries all reaffirmed their support for ASEAN centrality and the mechanisms within the regional architecture. But critics amongst us who have been following the developments of these concepts and strategy are quick to point out that move, right, this move to reference ASEAN is really an afterthought, and that none of the strategy and concepts, had ASEAN interest in mind, at least not in the early conception. And it will be of great concern here in Southeast Asia if the Quad is an indication that the four major powers are exploring alternative to ASEAN, especially now with talks on formalizing these groupings, right? So whether or not this is a fair and well-grounded assessment, I'll leave it to the experts amongst us to comment on this later. In my mind, even if this is true, it should not be at all surprising given ASEAN's performances, right, in recent years, and it's only natural for stakeholders, including Southeast Asia's closest partner, to question ASEAN's convening power. It is indeed incumbent on ASEAN to prove its worth if it wants to remain central, right? On the other hand, I'm also wondering if we can argue that perhaps engagements between ASEAN and the Quad countries worked to take comfort that the fact that since ASEAN and its centrality are being mentioned more now, this could mean that there's an element of accommodation at work where ASEAN's concerns are incrementally being taken on board by the Quad. And this, I'll leave it to my friends here listening in to tell me again that I'm being overly generous or that I'm being hazed by rhetorics, yeah? Because I too can see the weakness of this argument, right? How can this be operationalized? How can the Quad preserve ASEAN centrality when ASEAN as yet do not have a seat at the table, right? If we can agree that ASEAN centrality relies on the goodwill and support of major powers to thrive, as much as ASEAN member states' own commitment to institutional cohesion, then the last few years kind of taught many in Southeast Asia a key lesson that whatever goodwill and support we in Southeast Asia enjoys or are still enjoying should not be taken for granted. And moving on to my third and final point, which I mentioned earlier, is simply a set of questions to help me think through the way forward. First, how do the Quad countries assess engagement with ASEAN and its member states on the Indo-Pacific concepts outside of the Quad framework, right? Were there more buy-ins at the bilateral level? And by that I meant, when individual Quad states present the respective concept and strategy to the to a singular, ASEAN country. I think Kiba Sensei there earlier mentioned, a Japanese perspective on this already. I think the Quad as an informal grouping engaging Southeast Asia is not the only multilateral platform each of its members are involved in, right? But now with the talk of a potential formalizing of this group, will it be the most important one? Is there a case to be made that it should not be and need not be? Is there a way to bring better clarity that the two can be delinked, i.e. the buying in of the strategy and the concept is not synonymous to the supporting it's not synonymous to supporting the Quad framework. Must it be a package deal, so to speak, for Southeast Asia? Of course, I don't know if answering any of these questions, especially the last one, will help alleviate the concerns ASEAN member states have on the Quad, but I do look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jane, for that honest, frank, and I would say very enlightening take on ASEAN's perspective on where Quad is heading and how it kind of interacts in the future with the region. And I completely agree with you that if real conflicts can stoke perceptions, perceptions of conflict can also stoke conflicts in return, which is the classic security dilemma. And in some sense, the Quad countries also need to take a step back and kind of rethink their approach towards the region. Having said so, we have now almost 45 minutes. So thank you all for keeping to the time. And we now, because of that, we now have a lot of time to go into the discussion. And as there are some questions which are pouring in, but I will wait for others to send their questions on the chat box. So all of you who are listening in, thanks for your participation, but also do participate by sending in questions. We have such an expert panel and I thought-provoking views on such an important topic. So I would say that utilize that space as much as you can. But here are 2 or 3 things before we actually get into the questions. And I want you all to kind of think about these 3 or 4 things before we head into the discussions. First of all, I really want to talk about the Quad Plus, which Shankari kind of mentioned, and even Jane mentioned about ASEAN seat on the table. So who should get a seat? And what should be Quad's strategy to get ASEAN on the seat? It appears that there are few whom Quad wants to work with, particularly Vietnam, because they kind of share the same intensity of security concerns vis-a-vis China. So how do you engage with the region? Should you engage on an exclusive basis, or you should engage the whole region? So just your thoughts on that, coming from different perspectives from Quad as well as from ASEAN. The second issue, which is very pertinent, which Kiba-san touched upon on democracies. But there is also this very proselytizing nature of the Quad, in a sense, of so the very characteristic of the Quad, in some sense, a gathering of the democracies. And it is extremely pertinent with what is happening in Myanmar right now. So how do you tie it up with the larger domestic instability in the region, and where do these countries come in? And particularly because there is no set model of international politics anywhere. So does this create greater contradictions, or is it something really which Quad can help with in the region? The third thing which I want you guys to kind of focus upon is this idea of crowding the South China Sea. So this is what it appears to be one of the Quad's strategy now, is to crowd the South China Sea with foreign navies, whether it is Europeans, whether it is the Indians who sent a warship during the conflict with China recently in the Himalayas. And what it does, to ASEAN, where does it put ASEAN? We know that Queen Elizabeth is going to sail soon to the region. US is thinking about the first fleet, so to say. So there is an anticipated crowding. It definitely makes life difficult for China, but it also makes life difficult for ASEAN countries. So how can we do that? And lastly, I think this is the central question: is ASEAN exogenous in some sense to what is happening in the region, particularly because it is much more about what these great powers and China does rather than what ASEAN does, given the relative capacity and all that. So how can ASEAN indigenize the strategic churn which is happening in the region, or should it leave it to the major powers in some sense, or their reactions? So it is not as if what ASEAN does to contain or stabilize Indo-Pacific, it is much more incumbent upon the great powers on what they do actually, which then creates a ripple effect all over the region. So if we go in a reverse order, starting from Jane and then Kiba-san and then Shankari. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Yogesh, for the whole list of questions. I'll pick and choose if you don't mind me on this, especially, I will not focus on topics that are not within my area of expertise. Sure. On your last question on, whether is it incumbent on ASEAN or not, I think, if we draw this back to the question of, ASEAN centrality, right? If it's left to the great powers, I think ASEAN centrality is definitely lost. In fact, when the FOIP was presented, in the region, there is already a lot of discussion that, why is ASEAN not the one driving, these sorts of discussion, right? The AOIP came much later. In a way that, there were already critics that says that, hey, that is already one indication on how, the extra regional powers are dictating the agenda in the region. Personally, I would absolutely be terrified, if we go with your suggestion that let the great powers sort it out, right? Because they are sorting it out in regional waters. That is not a good idea for any Southeast Asian countries. On the crowding on the South China Sea, it's a very interesting one because, as you know, Southeast Asian countries are open to engaging with all countries. So showing of flags in the South China Sea is welcome, but it's about what you do in regional waters that, becomes problematic, where you do it and what you do, right? So if we want to talk about, trying to attract extra regional navies into the South China Sea and to put it into the context, right? In a way, my view is that China will not and cannot give up its claims, in the South China Sea, and not at least in the near to medium term. So whatever you do there is very unlikely to reverse their policy in the South China Sea. But we must also remember that China also cannot stop the US and its allies and partners from operating in the South China Sea without risking a war, which, many experts say that is unlikely to win. And so this is where, I want you to draw you back again, and link to your first question is that, with all the navies operating in the South China Sea, as vast as it is, there is always going to be a risk of incidents and accidents at sea. And that has been a concern for Southeast Asian countries across the board. So, and if I can just take, your first question last, in terms of the Quad Plus, I'm not sure if I can agree with you, Yogesh, in that, any of the Southeast Asian countries are trying to vie for a seat at the Quad. I think for the reasons that I've presented in my remarks is that, none of them are absolutely comfortable with that, and especially since you mentioned Vietnam in that sense as well. So, I would say that, your point on it would need to be engagement at a region-wide approach. It would have to be, at the ASEAN, at the institutional level. And this is where, Kiba Sensei's earlier suggestion that, some of these activities should be embedded within the ADMM plus processes, right? So that, I think it would be much more acceptable to the ASEAN states, wherein, the Quads are introducing, the Quad countries, not the framework, the Quad countries are introducing, right, new initiatives to further, engage the ASEAN processes, to revitalize, to a certain extent, the activities within regional frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to say that I'm trying to be deliberately provocative because I want to learn from such an expert panel, which is right here. And I'm trying to just utilize the space. So sorry for being provocative, but definitely thanks so much for those very interesting comments. I get to learn a lot out of this discussion. So yeah, Kiba-san, any questions you want to address, please?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the Quad Plus questions, as Jane mentioned, I also don't think it's a good idea to divide ASEAN or pick up our preferable countries like Vietnam. No? So at least we need to keep two conditions. The first, we should, the Quad countries should allow their hedging strategies. So they are still hedging the two options, or the 2 or 3 or 4 options. Second, we shouldn't condemn the member states for not being democratic. So do not blame Myanmar, for example. So probably based on the ASEAN framework, we can make some loose engagement platform. For example, if the Biden administration organized a democracy summit in the region, then they may come. I don't know. It depends on the procedure and the module what the US is doing. But for example, if there is an international conference or regional conference of AIIB is held in the region, anyway they come. No, anyway they just go visit the conference and test the water. So in that sense, they will come to the Democracy Summit, but it's more effective if we do something related to the ASEAN platform. For example, the ADMM retreat, which has been proposed from China for several times in the past. So like, anyway, the US should come to the region. For the long absence of Trump administration, the leadership of the US in EAS and the ASEAN related conferences, we should invite Biden or the higher leadership from the US to the region. And then of course it's after COVID, but then we can somehow expand the existing framework of ASEAN. It depends on them, but we can propose such agenda, like a ADMM retreat or ASEAN retreat or a special democracy conference, democracy summit as a side event of the ASEAN summit or the EAS, whatever, or the track 2 or track 3. So those are the things. And then that's the time we can talk about democracy without blaming some particular countries. I will stop here.
Sankri?
Sorry, let me unmute myself. Thank you, Yogesh. I think you've flagged a few very important points, and let me sort of take it. I'll take the question on the, you want us to go one question at a time, I presume? I can't hear you. You're muted.
I'm saying whichever ones you think, whichever.
Okay, I'd like to answer. All right, let me sort of address. I think I'll probably end up addressing quite a few then. All right, because I'll take the first as the Quad Plus. If we look at how the Quad Plus actually emerged, okay, even before any effort to formalize the Quad, suddenly we were hearing all these stories about the Quad Plus. And I think it's a little bit jumping the gun in that sense to say that the Quad Plus has is in place, because there is no Quad Plus in my view. And if I want to be brutally honest, what I want to add is that if you see the kind of information exchange that took place at the height of the COVID pandemic, all right, what happened is that as a consultative mechanism, you saw the 4 Quad members, and then they roped in 3 other members, that is South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. Okay, in order to look at, and I would say this information exchange consisted primarily of information relating to management of the pandemic, how best practices that countries were adopting with one another, definitely about passengers who are stranded in various countries and the mechanisms being, implemented to take care of those passengers and citizens of countries which were stuck elsewhere. The Quad Plus meetings emerged in this specific context. So now, if I have to go back to the point that both Saya-san made as well as Jane made in their presentations about where the Quad emerged from in 2007, this was actually the Quad's, raison d'etre, as they call it, because what the Quad actually, in fact, emerged from was the tsunami and the entire focus on HADR, which I think Sayak-san has raised, and the focus on the non-traditional security issues that were, shaping the region, and, sort of coordination on that aspect. That was the first Quad 1.0, or the original avatar of the Quad. Now, if you take that, the pandemic provided the opportunity to engage at that level as one of the one of the serious issues of NTS that we've had, non-traditional security threats that we've recently seen in the region. Now, my sense is that it got blown out of proportion, all right? And so people started talking about a Quad Plus, and suddenly you're you're finding articles on the Quad Plus, you're finding reports on the Quad Plus. I mean, that I would hesitate to put it out there, because the Quad itself is largely informal at this stage, all right? And without any sense of, and I think there's a very important issue here that Jane also raised in terms of the Quad. If you look at the Quad, she's right, because if you've heard what, all of you are, those of you in the region, especially Singapore, if you've heard what Ambassador Bilahari Kaushik has said on the Quad, which I find him absolutely interesting, because he always comes up with these wonderful remarks, which makes you think. And he says it's like the elephant with 4 blind men sort of figuring out what it actually means. At one of his presentations, I've seen this. Now, what I find interesting is, yes, it is the case. I completely agree that it's like an elephant with the 4 blind men. But at the same time, if you read the writings of scholars like Professor Rory Metcalfe and others, they say that this degree of ambiguity allows for a certain level of synthesis among the Quad on larger issues, whereas you don't have to have a tightly knitted kind of a approach to the Quad. Now, this is it. So putting the cart before the horse, or putting a Quad Plus before the Quad itself, I would not actually go down that road at all. Now, you raised the question on Vietnam in the Quad. Now, let me be very clear. Vietnam may be one of the countries that looks supportively at the Quad, but I don't think Vietnam can be disassociated with ASEAN and brought into the Quad. That's not ideal, okay? Now, the core of ASEAN's worry, and I think somebody has raised this question, is on the salami slicing, which I'll come to later. But I don't think that this doesn't do service to ensuring ASEAN, that the Quad and ASEAN can work together. By bringing members from the ASEAN into the Quad, you're actually doing a disservice. That's my first point on the Quad Plus. On democracies and the proselytizing nature, I think, yes, this is a very valid question, which is why I raised this as one of the contradictions, I mean, if you look at initially when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe spoke about the diamond, the democratic diamond, that the 4 countries represent this diamond. And then later on, you've had people speak about of a democratic alliance. Then you've had President Biden talk about a democratic alliance. I don't think this is the way to go ahead, okay? Now, what is happening on the internal affairs of state, I think the ASEAN would comfortably, and I'm putting this particularly in the context of ASEAN states, ASEAN would prefer it to be, as usual, non-interference in internal affairs. Now, whether you like it or not, this is their principle. And as countries that are trying to bring, if you're saying, I mean, Jane has said that, it's like paying lip service to ASEAN when you're saying the centrality matters. But then if the centrality of ASEAN matters, you have to keep the democratic issue out of it. Okay, and there is no reason why that should be brought in. You have to look for avenues to work without bringing the internal political or the domestic political angle into it. And I think that's where, whether it's the case of Thailand and the protests there, whether it's the case of Myanmar, it may pain the Quad members to see what's going on in Myanmar, as it does any one of us. But the point is, it's something that has to be resolved among the people there. And I think India would probably take a similar position if it came to the question of internal affairs. And so I think I sort of respect that and, think. The question of crowding the South China Sea, I think that's the best idea, because the more you crowd it, the less one person can dominate it, right? So it's not a question of insecurity so much. And I think what it is it that when you talk about a global commons or a maritime commons, I think the term commons actually refers to the fact that every country has an access to it, right? So, and Jane is absolutely right. When you work the basis of the UNCLOS and you work the entire processes of the principles of the Convention on the Law of the Seas, they've all emerged after years of conflict and discussion to resolve certain matters. So I think that need not be challenged by anyone. But the understanding, but when I mentioned that crowding could actually be good, that because you're not only seeing the Quad and ASEAN in the region, but you're seeing multiple minilateral, like trilaterals are coming up. There are trilateral engagement with India, Indonesia, and Australia. There is a trilateral between Japan, Australia, and India on the maritime front. There is increasingly France is coming in. Germany is showing an interest. The UK is showing an interest, as you've already mentioned. So I think this is more of a kind of a signaling, I would say, that, rather than taking this credibly at face value, that it's an kind of securitizing the issue. But Jane is right insofar as saying that incidents at sea are a possibility, and that's where I think I want to point out that preventive diplomacy has to become part of both the ASEAN and the Quad at some point. You cannot just have confidence building, because confidence building can still be undermined. Let me stop with this.
Thank you so much. I think my questions took a lot of time. but yeah, now we have a series of questions, and I was just trying to put them together in some sense or the other, but I will generally open it up to you, and any one of you feels to comment on that, please feel free to comment on that. So first of all, the first question comes from Alexander Boden. Alex wants to hear from what potential does the Quad have to provide increased security in ASEAN vis-a-vis cybersecurity governance? But I'll club it up with non-traditional security issues. So if any of you would want to comment on that, maybe Jane, you want to start with that?
Unfortunately, the cybersecurity issues is not covered by the Maritime Security Program. But I thought, Kiba Sensei's comments earlier and suggestion in her remarks was, did answer some of these questions in terms of, how the Quad countries rather than the Quad framework, definitely has an interest, right, in helping and collaborating with Southeast Asian countries in dealing with some of these common security challenges, non-traditional especially, right? And they are already very good, frameworks, for some of these issues to be dealt with in collaboration with partnerships outside of the region. So I think, it's there. So the only question I would often raise, and this is drawing back to maritime security, for example, is that there are plenty of, maritime security related regional, mechanisms and initiatives. Unfortunately, not all of them are active. So perhaps this is where, some of the Quad countries, especially those with capacity and experience, right, could think about, revitalizing some of these initiatives. Thank you.
Right. Kiba-san, on the larger regional security perspectives, mechanisms, forums, clubbing cybersecurity into the larger security governance and
well, it's a tough question, At least in ADMM Plus, there has been an expert working group on cybersecurity. So I'm not following the details of the discussion, but what is important is to let them sit, let the ASEAN members to sit the driver's seat, right? Well, that has been emphasized for years. And what was good in the HADR conferences and activities in 2010s and later, and the recent activity was that the ASEAN countries could feel comfortable. Particularly the military officers, they just simply feel comfortable discussing among the ASEAN countries. So even though they invited the UN or American experts as a lecturer to learn the US framework or UN framework on humanitarian assistance, then they can discuss what is the ASEAN model, what is their way, so they can rebut. They can make a very good rebuttal later against that kind of existing Western framework. And then gradually they found it comfortable talking among ASEAN countries. I think that cybersecurity or maritime security, that kind of momentum is, creation of momentum is still possible. So they can share the shared dilemma, like even though they don't want to take side, the Americans' assistance is very, very attractive, and then the China's option is also attractive. So we are actually buying in double buying situation, those kind of things. No, what is good in ASEAN and ADMM Plus is to provide a platform for the practitioners of ASEAN countries to share such a real open discussion and concerns among themselves. Yeah.
Shankari.
Okay, I'll be very brief on this because I think I'm already speaking a little too much on various questions, which I think are interesting from my side. I really don't work on the digital aspect of it, but let me say one thing, that if you look at the last year and the kind of digital warfare that has taken place, particularly between China and Australia, I think there is a space where the question of cybersecurity emerges and becomes much more critical for us to look at. And in that sense, if the Quad can actually address these kind of NTS issues, which will again, like I said, be taking it back to the more of the NTS angle, I think it would be probably better accepted in the region, because that would be crucial as far as the region is concerned. And I'll stop with that.
So I got to club two questions which are around democracy in Myanmar. Sakamoto-san wants to ask whether this heavy emphasis on democracy, and even the Quad is kind of divided on its emphasis on democracy. US, kind of leads the way. The Indians might not be so, but whether what it does to the prospect of creating, a coalition of the willing in the ASEAN region, and does it push some of the non-democratic countries into China's arms, so to say, and that is critical to how Quad looks at Myanmar particularly. But tying to that is the question by Watanabe-san, where he basically asks, and this is around ASEAN countries, what ASEAN countries expect the US, particularly the Biden government, and how the Biden government is going to address the Myanmar military coup. But also, if I can club this up with the larger Quad approach, that would be great to kind of have the set of comments on you on democracies, Myanmar's, and Quad's approach. Yeah. Should I start with you, Shankari, this time?
Okay, sure, please. I think we've already sort of covered the track. So let me just make an emphasis on what I see is the Myanmar situation alone, rather than going back to a discussion on the broader issues of the Democratic Alliance. So if you take the case of Myanmar itself, I think like you said, the Quad is very divided on what is happening in Myanmar. India has sent out a kind of a lukewarm kind of a statement on the restoration of normalcy and political normalcy as soon as possible. If you look at the case of the United States, it's talked about and clearly moving towards sanctions, which is also likely to be in the case of the EU. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I think this is, as far as the United States and other Western countries are concerned, this may be counterproductive, because it will push Myanmar closer into the Chinese stranglehold, which I think is where you need to be very careful at this point in time into sort of balancing what is happening internally in Myanmar with what is the external situation in the region altogether. So that is not what you would want to see, because sanctions have not really made had any impact in the years earlier. So in that sense, I don't think that would be a very good idea. I'm very happy with what the statement that has come out from the ASEAN more recently 2 days ago, because initially last week when we were looking at the scenario, it seemed a bit uncertain as to where ASEAN was whether it was going to take a joint statement or not. But I think what has come out from the ASEAN currently is a positive indicator in that sense. Thanks.
Kiva-san, your views on Myanmar and US Biden
Yeah. Well, for the Myanmar, I think the economic sanction as well as the diplomatic condemnation can work. And we expect the US to do as it was before, right? So, and then I still believe or expect a kind of a mechanism of peer pressure among the ASEAN militaries. So they all look each other. Okay? So when there was a coup in Thailand in 2014, everybody was watching Thailand and what kind of sanctions the Thai military is done by the United States, like the joint exercise or cancellation of the senior staff exchange, etc. And then we learned that it's not really significant. No? So now they are learning from each other's experience. So that's why we would like to see how the Myanmar is sanctioned, and then we want to see what happens to the countries which caused the coup d'etat like that. And then what will be the consequence? So in that sense, the US should be as it used to be like that. And then the Quad countries also should basically support that move, because the Quad is an association of democratic countries. But let us expect more among the ASEAN countries, because they are just comparing the benefit and disadvantage of democracy backsliding. Yeah.
Right, Jane, do you have any comments on the Myanmar situation? Okay.
Always risky to comment on things that's not within your area of expertise. So in a way, I thought Prof. Shankari's comments make sense. It makes sense because, she understands ASEAN the best, right? And, on the point about sanctions, I think today itself, the news already came out that, Myanmar is prepared for the sanctions, right? So in a way, they are already telling you that, look, it's not going to matter to us anymore, right? So, honestly, I'm very doubtful in terms of, what kind of local standard ASEAN will have, as an institution in dealing with the particular, tragic, situation at hand.
So the next question is from Nishida-san, my colleague at SPF, and he's very interested to know that if Quad plus would lead to, some kind of hostile perceptions within Quad, then what would be the optimal way to approach, ASEAN countries? Would it be bilateral? Would it be going outside the framework of the Quad? So how should the Quad countries approach, countries in ASEAN? So any thoughts on that from any of the panelists?
Who's to answer it first,
Dr.
please?
Kiva, do you want to go first?
Let me give some moment. So the question is to us, what do we perceive as the salami slicing of ASEAN?
All of you, yes.
I thought this question is to Shankari. Wait.
No, yes, sorry, I kind of missed that. Yes, Shankari, the question is to you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
yes.
I missed that too. Okay.
Yeah,
I remember because when I read it in the first round, I knew there was a question on salami slicing, but I thought maybe I made a mistake. Sorry, Nishida-san.
I might be managing too many things here. Sorry.
No. My apologies, Nishida-san. I will answer your question. I think if you look at the entire question on salami slicing, it has actually come during the Trump administration and the Chinese position vis-a-vis the ASEAN. I mean, the very fact that, the 2012 summit, when Cambodia refused to take a position on the joint communique, that itself triggered this debate on whether salami slicing of the ASEAN had started. And this was, again, addressed when the Trump administration was in power, particularly because you see the National Security Strategy paper of 2017 identifying both China and Russia as revisionist. And then subsequently, the Indo-Pacific report that came out, again, spoke about ASEAN as friends, potential friends, and unfriendly states, So for that was the first time this entire context of signaling the entire issue of the salami slicing took place. So if the Quad were to engage, this is exactly why I said the Quad Plus does not have much validity. If the Quad were to engage with the ASEAN, I think it needs to engage with ASEAN as a grouping. Because if you're talking about ASEAN's centrality, then you need to address that centrality and find convergence with that centrality, which is why I said both international law as well as rules-based order will become very, very predominantly the areas of complementarities. Thank you.
Sure. There is another question by CW. I can't know the person, but the question is how soft power approach work when it comes to humanitarian issues and to avoid what is thought to be internally interventionist. Could you also let us know the work of ADHR on COVID-19 if there are any lessons from that? So who among you want to go first? Shankari, I will turn to you again.
No, I think it's better that Kiba-san answers it because she's the one who referred in her paper to the softer power. I think.
Sure. Okay, well, the reason why the HADR conferences and activities were highlighted and welcomed by the ASEAN countries is because it includes the issue of international intervention, right? So the Philippines couldn't handle the massive disaster. That's why they had to welcome the other militaries like the US and then other, neighboring countries. So, and then it caused some problem on doctrine, principles, and operation on the ground. In case of the COVID-19, we cannot see such international assistance arised by the pandemic. So the military in Southeast Asian countries are playing the significant role, but it's all domestic. It's a domestic relief operations. So I cannot see the common interest among them to enhance the further discussion on the COVID-19. Probably among the international seminars, the webinars and conferences I recently attended, emergency declaration and legislation problem is one key common interest of the ASEAN militaries. But again, the military is not sitting in the major. Military is not a major driver of that legislation. It's a parliament, but how that emergency decree or state of emergency is legalized or imposed by the political leader, the governing elite, and then how the military cope with the civilian leadership. So that's one of the key key topic that they can compare each other. But it's not really international. It's more on domestic, and each country has their own background. Like Taiwan, some of the question is about Taiwan. We can learn a lot about Taiwan's CDC Act and how the legislative body could manage the legitimacy matter of the emergency decree. But I don't know if the ASEAN military officers and ADMM plus countries are interested in such a debate, and if they can share the common ASEAN value through such a debate. Yeah, about the others?
If anyone of you, Shankari, do you have any comments on the ADHR question? Or
no, I'll leave it because I think
Okay.
it's been well covered. So we'll take some other questions. Perhaps that's better.
Yogesh, you're muted.
Yogesh, your mic is off.
Sorry. So there is another question from Hanyu-san, which touches upon the Taiwan question, which Kiba-san touched upon, but basically looks at the question of Taiwan, both from the perspective of the Quad and the ASEAN, and because it is central to South China Sea. So is there any momentum towards, some kind of dialogue which is happening between Quad and ASEAN, or some kind of complementarity on the question of Taiwan? Or should that be a question at all? If I could put it in a different framework.
Who is it addressed to, please?
It's addressed to everyone. So, so it's okay in a sense that, I think the question of Taiwan, Hanyu-san thinks that it's critical in a sense, but which is so to some extent, particularly from the US perspective and the South China Sea perspective. But moving on, this is an interesting question again, the COVID vaccine war between US and China, and how does it affect ASEAN countries? The topic is broad in a sense, but so to put it in a different way, the COVID itself had created perceptions of how it was handled and what would be the geostrategic implications going forward. So in that case, COVID becomes extremely important. Mm-hmm. And what have been the perceptions in ASEAN and the Quad countries of how has it been managed? And what would that do to the larger geostrategic churning in ASEAN as well as in the region, if I could reframe that question. Shankari, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, because I think when you look at the entire question of the COVID crisis itself and what kind of strategic implications it has, let me bring it from two angles, okay? First and foremost, I think for the first time we saw that, like I said in the presentation, this has actually blown the dynamics on the major power rivalry, the lid off of it completely in that sense, and the kind of rhetoric that we saw being exchanged between the two, the major powers, that is both China and the United States. I think it sort of really sent home the message that there's tremendous negativity brewing between the two. Now, apart from that, I think one of the things has been the manner in which China has been able to handle it. And in some senses, I think many countries have some regard and respect for the entire ability of China to have controlled the pandemic, at least within the country, okay? Now, the nature of the United States system is such that the control was completely, it went all over the place. So in that sense, I don't think the domestic implications of individual countries have handled it can impact the geostrategic environment. And I think that's very, very clear when you look at, there is also a sense that if you look at the readings that have come out, that there is a duality of approach that you've seen as far as the Chinese are concerned. that on the one hand, they were the ones who contributed the maximum in terms of assistance to the region. And yet, if you see the number of incursions in the South China Sea, the number of incidents in the South China Sea, it has also been equally, very, very visible at this particular time. So in that sense, for me, as a person who looks at the entire region from outside, sitting at a location that's outside the region, that became rather evident. So I think it has, while there is a non-traditional aspect to the way the COVID-19 has happened, I think increasingly it has also revealed the traditional security aspects that are coming up in the region. Thank you.
Dr. Kiba, COVID-19, and where does Quad and ASEAN go from here?
Yeah. So there are two aspects, like how the state, the recipient country, as a state, react to that kind of mask diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, or disaster diplomacy in general, and how the public of the recipient country react. So at least among the leaders, they cannot help giving nice remarks to China, because they are already receiving the three kinds of Chinese vaccine, right? So Jokowi, Duterte, or all the other leaders of the ASEAN countries, they cannot be hostile to China. That's common sense. But how the China vaccine is appreciated in the general public, I'm very doubtful. At least when I read the local newspapers, there are so many skepticism over the countries, the cross countries, and then domestic context, and how, so that the public is also worried about, how they are controlled by China's vaccine or China's disaster diplomacy. And those kind of stories are the kind of things you hear almost about every day. So I'm very doubtful if the general public appreciate that kind of vaccine diplomacy. But at least when you see the remarks of the leaders, at least, yeah, they are getting more friendly to China. That's natural. But it doesn't mean that China is winning the war, the vaccine war. Yeah.
Thank you. Jane, I've already asked you to wear so many hats today. But for the last time, do you have any comments on the larger perceptions of COVID-19 and what it does to Quad and ASEAN?
No, I definitely have to you on this one, to the two experts here with us today. Yeah. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Thank you so much. I think we are towards the fact and basically of the panel, which I would consider to be one of the best panels we have organized so far, and the kind of overall themes we discussed around Quad and ASEAN, but particularly also the questions, in a sense, both the intensity of the debate, the different perspectives which came together, in a sense that we have accomplished at least one formal, one important task, which is bestowed upon us analysts, which is to start the debate in the most frank and honest way, which we can only do outside the state, so to say. And that is where I think, is the most important contribution of this debate going forward. And this is how we both at the Institute of South Asian Studies and at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation wanted these panels to actually, perform the task which we thought they would. And definitely this panel again has contributed to extending the boundaries of knowledge on these subjects, but also kind of extend the boundaries of debate and discussions. So thank you everyone to have participated in this panel from all over the world, so to say, but particularly our speakers who made time, give incisive comments at many a times at my prodding, went over the boundaries of their disciplinary, their disciplinary boundaries, and wore many hats, as Jane did a lot of times today. But thank you so much for your participation, for your time, and we look forward to kind of keep on engaging with you on these questions, which kind of not only has an implication on our present, but has far-reaching implications for the future. So thank you so much for your time and effort. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.